Hafford, better known to us as Brad, who is the project manager for the Digitization Project.
Okay, thanks, Deb. Thanks for organizing this. I think it's a great thing to talk about. I am primarily, of course, a Near Eastern Bronze Age archaeologist, so somewhat earlier than much of what we're hearing, but these issues of digitization concern us all. In my field work, I have been working in Syria, and now we'll be working in northern Iraq. The project I'm talking about, though, is all about legacy data and from southern Iraq at the ancient site of Ur. So, Ur is a place of countless stories, both ancient and modern. The goal of the Ur Digitization Project is to present the core data behind all of these stories and interconnect them in a way that assists researchers, educators, and the public alike. One of the first true cities in the world, and probably the site said in the Bible to be the home of the patriarch Abraham, Ur was occupied very roughly from 5000 to 500 BCE. Once supplied by the Euphrates, it was eventually abandoned because the river meandered too far away. It now sits some 5 miles southwest of the Euphrates in southern Iraq, very close to Talil Air Base. And we can see here from a satellite photo just how close the ancient site now sits to that air base, which now is called Imam Ali Air Base. Like many ancient cities, Ur was inhabited over millennia by thousands upon thousands of people, each of them with their own place in history, large, small, or in between. In the course of their existence, they made and used hundreds of thousands of objects and millions of actions and activities. Trying to understand all of this, to put it into a coherent picture of the city as a whole dozens of centuries after the fact, is a daunting task. Any single part of it might be well likened to a complex mystery. I just show here a few images of reconstructions that were drawn during the excavation period. Sir Leonard Woolley, who was the excavator, often posed his workers in activities that he thought might have been current in the day that the actual site was active, and he was well known for giving tours that brought back to life the period of the ancient Bronze Age. He also had his architect draw some of these watercolors, this by A.S. Whitburn, showing the double Mach as it may have looked when it was complete. So, in any of these, the detective or archaeologist must utilize clues to determine not only who done it, but also how, when, and why they done it. Like any mystery, the potential of a successful understanding depends on the number of physical clues available, the testimonials of witnesses, and the limits of our technology for investigation and analysis. Most of the excavation of the site of Ur occurred in a 12-year period from 1922 to 1934. It was conducted jointly by the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum under the direction of Leonard Woolley, who was knighted in 1935 as a direct consequence of his work. During the excavation, more than 15,000 field cards were produced, covering more than 25,000 artifacts. At least 4,500 handwritten field note cards were also produced, used later to aid in publication, and then stored in the British Museum. The actual publication record was good, with yearly reports appearing in the Antiquaries Journal, and eventually 10 excavation volumes and 9 volumes on cuneiform texts, though the full series took some 50 years to produce. And here I just show one of the field catalog cards as well as the cover of one of the excavation volumes. These publications have long been held to be the definitive record of Ur, and they do indeed hold much vital material. But the volumes, as extensive as they seem, say far from everything that can be said about the site. Moreover, they contain interpretations and only part of the data on which those interpretations were based. Woolley was a very good archaeologist for his day, but he could not publish every object nor completely explain every decision, particularly when limited to the slow process of paper publication. With the advent of digital publication, we can present all of our data, and more granting agencies are requiring exposure of all information from any project they support. But making old excavations digitally accessible is also necessary to allow for comparison and reinvestigation. It is, of course, time-consuming and often tedious, but important. And nowhere is it more important than for excavations that were subject to division in the age of partage. And this is just part of the Iraq Antiquities Law from 1924 that explains that a fair division of all objects between the government and the excavating institutions would be allowed. Laws of the early 20th century typically did allow for this sort of split. Ur was one such excavation, with half of the artifacts remaining in Baghdad and the other half going to London and Philadelphia. After the Iraq National Museum in Baghdad was looted in the wake of the Second Gulf War, it was found in some cases that records there were not complete enough to know exactly what was missing. The British Museum and the Penn Museum began to look at their collections in hopes of providing Baghdad with a complete list of one of the most important sites in Iraq, Ur. It was a site that provided many of the first entries into the National Museum since the country of Iraq itself was being formed at the time those excavations began, and artifacts that should be in Baghdad would be those that were not in London or Philadelphia. It turned out that the records in these two cities, however, were not as complete as would be hoped, and thus began a long project to upgrade records with the goal of helping all three museums to reunite Ur in a virtual space. We began by looking at our list of artifacts from the excavations, but quickly realized there was much more information that should be shared. Archives, photos, field notes, all held information on how and why Woolley had come to the conclusions he had. Furthermore, we found that the artifacts we had were often not connected back to their field data, having lost their field numbers. The potential was there to reconnect them and to put them all online for everyone's use, but in 2003, digital scholarship had not advanced to the level where such data could easily be published. It was possible, but it would take a great deal of money and time, and funds were slow in coming and small in number. We managed only sporadic collection of material such as scans of field notes in the British Museum and field photos in the Penn Museum. Finally, in 2011, with the increased ability of and interest in digital humanities, we received funding from the Leon Levy Foundation to conduct an exploratory year during which we would find out just how much Ur material was outside of Iraq, how scattered it was, as well as how long it would take to make it all digital. The exploratory year began in 2012, and we have now completed the initial study. We put all of Woolley's 15,000 artifact cards into a database and found that he often recorded several artifacts on one card. We split these entries to make one for every object excavated and written up at Ur. Meanwhile, we connected as many to their museum numbers as possible, but not all had this information in their records. About 40% had no connection. So this is just an image of how we were working at Penn, putting all of the field catalog cards into a searchable database, while at the British Museum they had created the relational database and added tertiary information that was in many of their cards to include even some Iraq Museum numbers wherever we had them already recorded. In the ideal, Ur artifacts in the various institutions would be reconnected to their field numbers and to any publication of that artifact, giving them as much information as possible and recording the current location of the object. But it began to look as though a one-to-one correlation would not be completely possible. More objects were exported from Ur than were recorded in the field catalog. Apparently, objects that were particularly common, such as pottery, were not recorded individually. Instead, Baghdad received samples of representative types, as did Philadelphia and London. Other objects that were deemed to carry little information, such as defaced or denuded cylinder seals, were also doled out as samples. Finally, samples of faunal remains, soil, seeds, and the like were also not given specific numbers, and yet some such samples do exist. So here we see a picture of the courtyard at the dig house at Ur, and you can see just how many hole pots were coming out. We don't have a complete record of those, but as we go through all of this, we're hoping to find that information and put it back together. Woolley did a typology. He didn't publish it well, though, so we have to reconstruct all of that. Furthermore, sometimes he would record an object with very little information. Here, for instance, is a cylinder seal that we have managed to connect back to this U1047 number, but you can see that all he said about it was that it was a cylinder seal of gray steatite with figures and inscription. In fact, U1048 says exactly the same thing, so this object could be either one of those, but at least I have the information as much as I can get from the original records for that object. Further complicating the situation, we found that some objects from Ur were sent to other museums around the globe, amounting to 37 institutions beyond the excavating museums as far afield as Australia and New Zealand. In some cases, the numbers were relatively substantial, including nearly 1,000 objects sent to Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery from the British Museum in several episodes between 1930 and 1960. Thus, as the project attempts to move into its implementation phase, it will require a great deal of cooperation among museums operating on well-established standards to create a research tool that includes everything from the site. But seeing just how widely scattered this material is and how loose and varied in its records, it becomes readily apparent just how necessary such a tool is. From an initial attempt to aid the Iraq Museum in its inventory and assessment, this project has grown to one that will help all researchers of the ancient Near East. During this first year, we conducted experiments in how long it takes to investigate each object, connect a field number where possible, photograph it, and assess it for conservation needs. We have concluded that it is possible to go through everything in London and Philadelphia in 3 to 4 years, and we are currently in proposal stage for funding that implementation phase. Concurrently, we will be scanning all archival records and transcribing them to make them searchable. So this is just our general 3-year plan that we are attempting to receive funding for, and the general goals that we have. We are trying to crowdsource some of the transcription of archival material already. This allows the public to assist in recording the words of the archaeologists and museum personnel communicating on the process of excavation nearly 100 years ago. We believe we can complete the archival component of the project in 1 year, though transcription of field notes may take a bit longer depending on the number and intensity of public participation. In our crowdsourcing experiment, we managed transcription of about 400 pages over 2 months, but of course quality control continues to be an issue that must be addressed as we hire more people for the project overall. So this was just an experiment to see, in many cases you can use optical character recognition on typed records, but we have a lot of handwritten records. People are interested in this period in history, and we have 80 volunteers right now that are helping us to essentially take letters like this or field notes, etc., and type them into the system. Now, the online site we eventually create will be a record of everything from Ur, essentially a modern publication, but also a research tool that provides ways of interlinking and presenting core data so that more can continuously be learned and published about the site and its history. It will be searchable textually, visually, and spatially. In other words, any keyword, artifact number, or other indicator in text can be entered, and all occurrences found throughout field notes, transliterated and translated cuneiform texts, catalog, and publications. Photos can be browsed and similar objects called up, and maps can be searched by area, room, or tomb, with the site populating these spaces with artifacts in context. Essentially, we're hoping to get to just what Adam was showing in his site, although the legacy data is not, of course, as complete. So we are limited by a certain amount of things, but hopefully we can create as much as we can towards this more modern view of a site. The website will be completely open under Creative Commons share-alike license wherever possible, and linked to other sites such as the online catalogs of relevant museums and the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative. So here I'm just showing our imagined concept. This is just one area of the site, the Old Babylonian domestic area known as AH, and of course we hope that we will be able to click on any room, bring up the other map or building here in this case, go to the room, find information from it. All of the field photo numbers will then be attached to it so that you can see anything with it. The artifacts from that area would be, you could call it up and you could get to the field records on that and any other records we might have. And then hopefully, of course, I'm sure that we can eventually do this, although we're not here yet, of course, you would be able to find other objects that are similar to that and analyze all of them. In linking, we want to not forget that much of this information is out there in some ways. This is the system called Merlin at the British Museum up in the upper right corner, and it records every object that's in the British Museum. It's out there and searchable. The information in it is not as complete as we would like, so we want to update that. Same with the Penn Museum. We have our system called EMU, which is searchable online, and we want to link rather than duplicate information. Similarly, the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative has many of the Ur tablets already photographed and transliterated. Not all of them have been translated. We're going to be working on that to try and upgrade and make sure we're linked to those sites. We plan to release the site in iterations, even though such iterations will not be fancy or flashy. Indeed, we hope to gain the feedback of researchers and the public in the use of the site with each release, with the first version slated to appear at the end of 2013. We are already operating crowdsourcing on such a model, with the current iteration of that site, urcrowdsource.org, already receiving feedback from involved users and awaiting potential funding to upgrade. Furthermore, the research site we intend to create will not solely be of use to those interested in the ancient Near East. We are uncovering and including data that is also of interest to scholars and aficionados of much more recent history. The excavation of Ur was conducted in a period of great importance to the modern Middle East, in a period that saw the creation of many modern nations of the region, not least of them Iraq itself. Archival records from Ur also include mentions of the Cairo Conference and such individuals as Winston Churchill, T.E. Lawrence, and Gertrude Bell. And this is just one of the early letters that's in our archives that's talking about potentially getting permits to dig in the new area, and it mentions Lawrence and Churchill. Here's Gertrude Bell at the Cairo Conference, and here the first permit to excavate ever issued by the nation of Iraq, and it was to Tel el-Cairo, which is Ur. Others may well be interested in Ur because of its links to Agatha Christie. Indeed, she met her second husband, Max Mallowan, here in 1929, and went on to work at many other sites with him. This is a photo of Agatha in the middle, and on the left we have Max Mallowan, and on the right, Leonard Woolley. She even based her book, Murder in Mesopotamia, on the excavations at Ur, modeling the fictional Tel Urimja on the site itself. I think she would be pleased to think of archaeological work as a kind of whodunit, but uncovering clues is only part of the task at hand. Being able to investigate them, put them all back together into an understandable whole, is a vital task that tends to take most of the time a researcher or detective needs. By creating the Ur virtual site, we will be reducing the amount of time needed to make new understandings of the site in history, ancient or modern. I myself investigated balance pan weights from Ur, and the process of gathering the data took more than 3 years. While working on this one aspect of life in the ancient city, I realized that anyone investigating any aspect would need to go through the same lengthy steps I did, visiting various museums not just to see artifacts, but also to see original records. And these are some of the field notes that are stored in the British Museum that we have now scanned and typed into catalogs. And one of the duck weights recorded there. Duck weights are a very common form. Essentially what I was trying to do was get all of my ducks in a row. Yes, and I think anyone would need to do that. Whether you're studying spear points or sling bullets or anything else, you're going to need to be able to get all of this information, and if you can get it all in one site, you could then know what you needed to see more efficiently and go to the museum still and see some of the objects that are important. Documenting Ur, then, is of importance to many people. Audiences for the research tool we are creating range from the student of ancient history to the readers of modern mysteries, and we hope to serve them all with the core data and recorded interpretations of it wherever possible. So what can our first-year exploratory Ur project say about best practices and realities of making legacy data digital and managing it in the long term? Well, first of all, that's an aerial photo from 1931 showing just how much work Woolley did. Those are extremely large backdirt piles. You can see that the ziggurat is over here in this is actually the northwest of the site, and that's an enormous building. So comparing it to these, it's unfathomable how much work he did. Anyway, best practices, many of this is fairly obvious. We need high-resolution archival scans, but also scaled-down scans that are easily accessible. Objects must be presented with their own stable and referenceable record, one whose web address does not change. This is essential for any work, since publication and reinvestigation of that work requires a link back to the original data. Creating links to other stable sites that contain similar information is also important. In this way, work is not duplicated. Two sites, such as the Cuneiform Digital Library and the Ur site, do not have separate and conflicting information, or if they do, the reason data conflict is readily apparent. Textual searches should be supported by dictionaries or thesauri that understand synonyms or something being searched. Ontologies are often very complicated, and the way that Woolley recorded an object may not match with the way we refer to such an object today, nor will it match with the way researchers in different fields refer to such an object. Metadata, as we all know, is vital, but not easy to standardize. Flexibility where possible is good practice. And we've just been discussing this, and I don't have an answer. I'm not quite sure exactly what I mean, but I'm hoping that we can tie this into all of these other concepts in order to be able to allow our data to be used anywhere in many different ways. I want to try and plan for unpredictable ways, which is difficult to do. Licensing to promote rather than restrict use and reuse is also extremely important. Creative Commons share alike requires only that attribution be made, and this is in the true spirit of scholarship. As with any real-world material, complexities abound. We want to connect every record related to Ur in any museum back to its original field record, but we have clearly seen that this will not be completely possible. We will be able to connect far more than are currently related, but a few will remain unidentifiable for many different reasons. Of course, the beauty of having all of the data in one place and so many people potentially examining it is that they may well see a connection we did not spot when we created the site. Cooperation and agreement on standards, ontologies, metadata, etc. is not always easy. Indeed, even at the level of gaining access to some artifacts, we are finding difficulty. We are in discussion wherever possible with the Iraq National Museum and the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities in Iraq, but have not yet gained their full participation in our project. The original intent was to show all Ur material that exists outside of Iraq, and we can accomplish that. But to have a complete research tool on Ur, we need to include information on the other half that resides in Baghdad. Finally, some of the further 37 institutions that received a few Ur objects no longer exist. Tracking down these objects will be particularly difficult. Making Ur legacy data digital and managing it online are more complex tasks than may appear from the outside, both researchers and funders. It is a time-consuming prospect that is not the most glamorous of propositions, yet it holds the potential for assisting research of all kinds, making the gathering of information on an important ancient city more efficient, more accessible, and much quicker. As a result, understanding of the city of Ur and the ancient Near East as a whole will be promoted and accelerated. I welcome any comments, suggestions, and/or volunteers to help us test our site iterations. Thank you.
We'll take a few minutes of questions, and then we'll take the scheduled break, so we may shorten it a bit.
I think that was a great illustration of the other end of what I was talking about. That is, if we can't do with our data, or somebody else can't do with our data in 100 years, what you guys are doing with Wooley's data after 100 years, we're in trouble. It's a tremendous effort, but if you do it, you can actually put a lot of it back together. And so that was really cool to see the sort of other end of it. I wanted to ask actually, though, about the crowdsourcing efforts and whether you are collecting or willing to share any statistics on who's using it, how long they're using it for, do you have repeat users, and what the rate of error is.
Well, I don't have all of that compiled yet, but I do know that, as with all the crowdsourcing people I've talked to, you tend to get a lot of volunteers and only a few do the real work. So yes, I have, out of those 80, probably 5 that really come back and do a lot. You know, most of them maybe do one letter. And I have one in particular who is very involved and talks to me a lot, and I think this is great. I need people like that. So the informed amateur can be extreme help. A lot of archaeologists, though, that I have approached about crowdsourcing don't even like the idea. I guess we tend to think, it took me 10, 15 years to understand what I'm doing. How can someone just out there in their armchair help me? They can. It depends on the sort of material you're giving them. And I've seen that involving the public is, I think, an important activity, and it helps us a lot. So yes, I hope to compile all of those stats, and of course, give thanks to those people. You know, what do they get out of this? Well, in our eventual site, we'll say special thanks to all the people who helped us with the transcription, list their names, and I even sent out a message at the holiday time saying thank you to all of you, because what else do I have to offer them except participation and thanks? You know?
Is the rate of inaccuracy in transcription something that you can comment on?
To an extent, and in particular, this person who is so involved has come to me sometimes and said, well, I just saw this one and it had these errors. I didn't know if you wanted me to fix them. And I said, well, yes, you know, I think that would be good. You can QC yourselves. In some of the bigger crowdsourcing efforts, they even have many people translate this or transcribe the same piece, not knowing they're all doing it. Then you can compare them and say, these people didn't agree, but here, most of them said it was this, so therefore it's probably that. Then you've cut down your quality control time. I don't have a system yet that can do that, but I am talking with people who will help me to do it, pending funding to create a better site.
Thank you.
Just a quick question. All of the records were scanned and then transcribed. Is the scanned version available as well?
Yes,
for people?
We're going to have, yeah. And so when you even go onto the site, of course, you can see the scan here, and you type in, and those will always be attached so you can come back. And we're keeping all of the spelling errors, et cetera, from the original, because that's the way it was, but you will see that it is still there.
Okay, if there are no further questions at this time, we'll go ahead and take a break. We were scheduled for a 10-minute break. Are people okay with a